What if the eating pattern modern wellness experts now sell, the whole grains, olive oil, fish, and figs, was already prepared beside the Sea of Galilee 2,000 years ago? We remember the meals of Jesus as miracles and symbols, but rarely ask how they nourished the body. His disciples walked long distances, crossed rocky hills, and worked through cold nights pulling heavy nets. Their food had to be simple, portable, restorative, and strong enough to keep them moving. Today, we're reconstructing 7 breakfasts from the Gospels and uncovering what each could do inside the human body. Stay for number 4, built from 3 foods mentioned repeatedly in Scripture, including one of the most counterfeited products on grocery shelves. Number 3 hinges on a detail found in some Bible translations but missing from others. Remember, only one of these meals was prepared by Jesus. The other 6 are reconstructions using foods the Gospel accounts specifically name. Let's get into it. Number 7, the Sabbath grain bowl, the breakfast picked from the side of the road. Picture Jesus and his disciples walking through open country on a quiet Sabbath morning. There's no cart behind them carrying supplies. There's no kitchen waiting around the next bend. There are no preserved provisions hidden inside their clothing. They are simply walking, and hunger begins to rise. The Gospel of Mark tells us that as they passed through the grain fields, the disciples began to pick heads of grain. They rubbed the heads between their palms to strip away the husks and chewed the kernels as they walked. What followed was a confrontation about Sabbath observance, and that argument is what survived in the text. But underneath the argument is an ordinary human detail that is very easy to walk straight past. The disciples were hungry. They reached for what was growing beside the road. Before this was a theological confrontation, it was breakfast. Now look closely at what that motion actually did. Rubbing grain between the hands removes the husk, the dry, inedible outer chaff, and nothing else. The bran, the germ, and the starchy center all stayed intact, and all went into the mouth together. The bran is where most of the fiber sits. The germ carries most of the vitamin E and a large share of the mineral content. Fiber slows the movement of food through the digestive tract, which produces a gentler blood sugar response than a meal built from stripped grain. Large population studies have consistently associated whole grain intake with lower cardiovascular risk. None of this was known to the men in that field. All of it was on their tongues. And here's the part worth sitting with. Industrial milling does not stop at the husk. It removes the bran and it removes the germ because both contain oils that turn rancid and shorten shelf life. What is left is the starchy middle. It stores for months in a warehouse. It is also the part with the least to give. A modern version could begin with cooked whole barley or wheat berries, softened in water, served with sliced figs, crushed nuts, and a small spoon of honey. Scripture does not record that combination. It is a reconstruction from the grain the disciples gathered and the foods that grew in that landscape. They were not following a program. They were hungry travelers eating what the field put in front of them. Nourishment does not always have to be complicated. Sometimes it begins with grain, fruit, water, and gratitude. Number 6, fig and barley flatbread. The breakfast Jesus went looking for and did not find. Early one morning, Jesus was walking back toward Jerusalem. Matthew tells us plainly that he was hungry. He saw a fig tree standing beside the road and went to it expecting fruit, and the tree had leaves and nothing else. What followed became one of the sharpest lessons in the Gospels about appearance without substance. The symbolism is so strong that the physical fact underneath it disappears. So, read the sentence again slowly. He was hungry. He saw a tree that looked as though it could feed him. He walked toward it. Before it was a lesson about fruitfulness, it was a man looking for breakfast. A ripe fig was close to a perfect food for a traveler. It required no cooking, no knife, and no preparation of any kind. Thin skin, soft interior, eaten in a moment. Fresh figs could be taken straight from the branch. Dried figs could be carried for weeks. Figs are also among the more mineral-dense fruits available in that world, carrying calcium, potassium, and magnesium, along with soluble fiber including pectin. Pair the figs with barley, and the plate gains something else. Barley matters in the Gospels because John identifies the 5 loaves at the feeding of the 5,000 specifically as barley loaves. Whole barley carries a soluble fiber called beta-glucan in a higher concentration than most common grains. During digestion, beta-glucan forms a thick, gel-like substance in the digestive tract. Research has associated it with improvements in cholesterol levels and with a flatter blood sugar response after a meal. Now the detail most people never hear. A large share of a fig's fiber and polyphenol content sits in the skin and in the layer immediately beneath it, the part that many people peel away out of habit. In dark-skinned varieties, the skin also carries anthocyanins that the pale interior does not have at all. The fig was designed to be eaten whole. Most of us stopped doing that. So imagine the plate, a rough barley flatbread, warmed and torn by hand, soft figs opened across its surface, crushed almonds or walnuts pressed into the fruit. No artificial flavors, no bright packaging, no ingredient engineered to sit unchanged on a shelf for a year. And notice what the fig tree story is quietly asking. That tree had leaves. That tree had no figs. Modern packaging displays leaves constantly, natural, wholesome, traditional, energy, clean, printed on the front precisely because those words do not describe what is inside. A plate made of recognizable food does not need to make promises. It looks like food because it is food. Number 5. The Father's plate. Egg, fish, bread, and herbs. In Luke chapter 11, Jesus asked his listeners a question about fatherhood. What father, if his child asked him for a fish, would hand him a serpent instead? Or if the child asked for an egg, would hand him a scorpion? The point was about the character of God, and it was not nutritional in any way. But look at what he reached for to make it. When Jesus needed 2 foods so ordinary that every single person listening would picture them instantly without explanation, he named a fish and an egg. That is not a menu. That is a window into what an ordinary household in Galilee actually kept. Eggs deliver complete protein, every essential amino acid, in an extremely compact package. The yolk carries choline, a nutrient involved in cell membrane structure and neurotransmitter production that a substantial portion of adults fall short on. It also carries lutein and zeaxanthin in a form the body absorbs readily, along with vitamin D, vitamin A, and B12. Fish contributes protein as well, and in oily species, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, and DHA, which observational research has linked with cardiovascular and cognitive outcomes. Bread supplies the carbohydrate. Fresh herbs add flavor without leaning on sugar. We should be careful not to invent what Scripture does not provide. We do not know which fish species were on which table. We do not know the portions. We cannot assume a fish from the Sea of Galilee matched the fat profile of modern salmon. Biblical nutrition should never be built on pretending the text says more than it does. Here is what almost nobody mentions about this plate. For roughly 3 decades, standard dietary advice was to discard the yolk and eat only the white. The white is mostly protein and water. Nearly everything else in an egg, the choline, the lutein, the zeaxanthin, the vitamin D, the B12, is concentrated in the yolk. Dietary guidance has since moved substantially on this point. An enormous number of yolks went into the bin in the meantime. A modern version, a boiled egg, a small portion of grilled fish, whole grain bread, cucumber, and fresh mint, parsley, or coriander. But the strongest thing on this plate is not the protein. It is the question. What happens when a hungry person asks for food? A loving father does not turn the request into danger. He does not mock the hunger. He provides. One meal says, "Go find something for yourself." Another says, "You are seen. Sit down and eat." The body receives nourishment. The person receives care. Number 4, bread, olives, and grapes. The table of remembrance. Bread runs through the entire ministry of Jesus. He taught his followers to pray for daily bread. He broke it before distributing it to crowds. He accepted it at the tables of strangers. At the Last Supper, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and handed it to his disciples, and he gave them the cup, drawn from the fruit of the vine. The Last Supper was an evening meal, not a breakfast, and the gospel accounts do not give us a complete menu. What they give us is a landscape: bread, oil, and the vine. 3 things that appear in that world more often than almost anything else, and that hold together on a morning plate as well as they did on an evening one. Start with the bread, and understand that the kind of bread decides almost everything. A dense, whole-grain loaf behaves differently inside the body than a refined loaf stripped of its fiber. Then, the olives. Olive oil is largely monounsaturated fat, and it carries a polyphenol called oleocanthal, which laboratory research found acts on the same inflammatory pathway as ibuprofen. It also carries hydroxytyrosol and a spectrum of related antioxidant compounds. Studies of Mediterranean-style eating patterns have associated diets rich in olive oil, vegetables, legumes, fruit, nuts, whole grains, and fish with cardiovascular benefit. That is, a pattern finding, not a bottle finding. The oil is not medicine, and pouring more of it over everything will not prevent disease. The benefit comes from the whole pattern and from what the oil replaces. Now, the part I promised you at the beginning. Olive oil is among the most adulterated food products in the world. Investigations across multiple countries have repeatedly found bottles labeled extra virgin that were blended with cheaper refined oil or pressed from olives harvested late when polyphenol content had already declined, or processed with heat that degrades the very compounds that made the oil worth studying. If you want the food the Gospels are describing, you want cold-pressed, early harvest, extra virgin oil from a producer willing to tell you the harvest date. Everything else is a different substance wearing the same name. The same logic applies to the grapes. Eat the whole fruit. The polyphenols in the fiber are concentrated in the skin and the seed, which is exactly what filtration removes when grapes become clear juice. So the plate is whole grain bread, olives, or a pour of good oil, whole grapes, and a small serving of nuts or cheese. It works because no single ingredient is asked to do everything, but the instruction underneath it is not about ingredients. Take the bread. Give thanks. Remember, most modern meals are eaten while driving, while answering messages, while thinking about the next obligation, and the food is gone before the mind has registered that a meal happened at all. This breakfast does not promise to heal the body. It invites the person living inside the body to come back to the table. Number 3, broiled fish and honeycomb, the breakfast that changes between translations. After the resurrection, Jesus appeared to his disciples and found them frightened and disoriented. They were not calm, and they were not certain. Luke tells us they thought they were seeing a spirit. Jesus showed them his hands and his feet, and then he asked them a startlingly ordinary question. "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in front of them. Understand what is happening in that room. This is not a meal about hunger. Jesus did not need the fish. The meal is the argument. A spirit does not chew. A vision does not take food out of a hand and swallow it. He ate in front of them because eating is the most physical thing a body can be seen doing. Nutritionally, the meal is straightforward. Fish supplies protein, which the body uses to maintain and repair tissue, and which contributes strongly to fullness. Depending on the species, it can also provide vitamin D, selenium, iodine, and B12. Broiling or grilling over an open flame generally requires less added fat than frying, though heavy charring is worth avoiding. Honey deserves one careful sentence because it is routinely oversold. Honey is, in the main, sugar. Raw honey does carry enzymes and trace compounds, and there is genuine clinical literature on honey applied topically to wounds. Eaten by the spoonful, however, it is a source of quick energy and flavor, not a treatment. A small amount is a small amount. A large amount is simply a large amount of sugar. And now the detail that brought you here. Open an older translation of Luke chapter 24, and you will find that the disciples gave Jesus broiled fish and a piece of honeycomb. Open most modern translations, and the honeycomb has vanished. Neither is an error. The phrase appears in a family of later Greek manuscripts and is absent from the earliest ones we possess, so translators weight the manuscript traditions differently and reach different decisions. This is why two people who both know this passage well can remember it differently, and both be reading their Bible correctly. A modern version: broiled or grilled fish, whole grain bread, fresh herbs, and a very small amount of honey. But the healing in that room was not biochemical. Their teacher had been executed. Their expectations had collapsed. Jesus answered the most disorienting event in human history with the most ordinary act available to a body. He ate. Sometimes, restoration begins with something plain enough to hold in your hands. Number 2. Barley loaves and small fish, the breakfast that began with not enough. A large crowd had followed Jesus into a remote place with no marketplace anywhere near. The disciples looked at the problem and ran the arithmetic, and the arithmetic failed. There were thousands of people and no source of food. Then, Andrew noticed a boy carrying 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. He said so out loud, and then he said what everyone in the group was already thinking. What is that among so many? Notice what John does with that sentence. He could have written that the boy had bread. He does not. He specifies barley. In that world, barley was the grain of people who could not afford wheat: soldiers on campaign, sailors, laborers, families living at the edge. That detail is not decoration. It tells you the meal that fed the crowd started as the cheapest food in the field. Barley earns the mention. Its beta-glucan content gives it a lower glycemic index than wheat or white rice, which means bread made from it releases energy over hours rather than in a spike and a crash. For a working body that had to keep going until sundown, that mattered more than flavor. But the small fish are the more interesting half of this meal. Small fish in that world were eaten whole, bones, skin, and all, usually dried or salted so they would keep. That changes what they deliver. The soft, edible skeleton of a small fish is a direct source of calcium. Much of the fat, which in oily species means the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, sits in and just beneath the skin. The darker flesh carries iron and B12. It is also worth being honest that preserved fish carried a considerable salt load, which is a real consideration for anyone managing blood pressure. Which brings us to what modern processing removes. A clean white fillet is muscle protein and very little else. The calcium in the bones, much of the omega-3 near the skin, and a good share of the vitamin D and B12 are all taken off in the process that produces it. Cultures that still eat sardines, anchovies, and small dried fish whole are eating the version the boy carried in his hands. Most of us are eating what was left after the rest was removed. A modern version, whole grain barley flatbread, grilled or tinned whole small fish, cucumber, fresh herbs, a drizzle of oil. Yet the story refuses to let nutrition be the point. Modern health culture begins with abundance. It tells you that you must buy the powder, the machine, the program, and the subscription before you are permitted to eat better. This meal begins with what is already in the room. 5 loaves, 2 fish, not enough by the calculation, and enough to begin. A healthier breakfast does not require a redesigned life. It can begin by changing 1 loaf. Number 1. Charcoal roasted fish and bread. The breakfast Jesus prepared with his own hands. The disciples had been fishing all night. They had gone back to the work they understood, and the night had given them nothing at all. No catch, no reward, only cold and wet rope and exhaustion. As morning began to show, someone was standing on the shore. They did not recognize him. He called across the water and told them to cast the net on the other side of the boat. They did, and the net filled so heavily that they could not haul it in. John understood first. It is the Lord. Peter did not wait for the boat. He went into the water and made for the shore. And when the others finally landed, they found a charcoal fire already burning, with fish cooking over it and bread waiting beside it. Then Jesus said, "The line this entire list has been walking toward. Come and have breakfast. Every other meal on this list is a reconstruction. This one is not. The fire was lit before they arrived. The fish was already on it. The bread was already there. Whatever else John chapter 21 is, it is a plain record of Jesus making breakfast for exhausted men before they were even close enough to ask for it. Consider what a body actually needs after a night of heavy physical labor without food. Its stored carbohydrate is depleted, and it needs carbohydrate to refill it. Muscle tissue has been broken down under load, and it needs protein to repair. Together, those two do what neither does alone. And there is a further layer worth naming carefully. Controlled sleep research consistently shows that sleep deprivation measurably impairs glucose handling, emotional regulation, and judgment. That is general physiology, not a claim about that specific morning. But it describes the men walking up that beach. Now, the detail that almost nobody notices, and that does not leave you once you have seen it. John uses a specific Greek word for the fire on that shore. Anthrakia, a charcoal fire. That exact word appears twice in the entire New Testament and both times in John's Gospel. The first is in chapter 18, in the courtyard of the high priest, where Peter stood warming his hands at a charcoal fire and denied 3 times that he had ever known Jesus. The second is here, on the sand. Peter comes up out of the water and smells the same thing he smelled on the worst night of his life. But this time, he is not standing at a distance in the dark, pretending. This time, he is being called closer, and there is food. John does not name the species of fish. He does not say the bread was barley. He lists no oil, no herbs, no fruit. Adding them would turn imagination into false certainty. Fish and bread. Protein for a body that had worked all night, carbohydrate to replace what the night had emptied. It was never supposed to be complicated. And after they had eaten, Jesus asked Peter 3 times whether he loved him. 3 denials answered by 3 chances to say otherwise, and each answer followed by responsibility. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. But notice the order. Warmth first, then food, then the conversation, then the work. He fed him before he questioned him. He did not open with the accusation. He opened with breakfast. Modern people reverse this order constantly. We demand explanations from exhausted people. We confront them while they are hungry. We ask for decisions before anyone has rested. We treat the needs of the body as a distraction from the real conversation. On that shore, the body was not a distraction. The body was the doorway. The breakfast did not heal Peter through a combination of nutrients. Bread and fish did not erase what he had done. The healing came from the person standing beside the fire cooking it, someone Peter believed he had lost forever. 7 breakfasts. 6 reconstructed from foods the text actually names, and 1 recorded plainly. And the same pattern running underneath all of them. The Gospels were never written as a diet program. Nobody in them promises that barley, figs, eggs, grapes, honey, bread, or fish will cure a disease. And this video does not promise it either. But the eating pattern is visible anyway, and modern nutrition keeps arriving at pieces of it. Whole grain rather than stripped grain. Fruit eaten whole rather than filtered. Fat from olives and nuts. Fish rather than heavily processed meat. Ingredients you could name to a child. Meals shared. Gratitude before eating. Now compare that with what is sold as nourishment today. Powders that require a machine, programs that require a subscription, packages printed with the words natural, wholesome, and traditional on the front, precisely because none of those words describe what is inside the box. Leaves on a tree with no figs on it. So here's the small thing to do this week. Choose one of these 7. Just 1. Prepare a simple version of it on a single morning. Do not prepare it expecting a cure. Prepare it as an act of attention. Sit down. Put the screen face down. Give thanks. Share it with someone if there is someone to share it with. And remember the last one. Exhausted men came in off the water carrying the weight of a failed night and found that someone had arrived before them. The fire was already burning. The bread was already waiting. The restoration had begun before a single word was spoken. Tell me in the comments which one you chose. Was it the grain the disciples rubbed between their hands on the Sabbath road? The fig tree that had leaves and nothing else? The boys' 5 loaves that everyone in the story agreed were not enough? I read every comment on this channel. And if you want more forgotten details from the biblical world, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We post every week, and the next one goes deeper still. I will see you there.